The establishment of racial classification in the United States Census began with the Founding Fathers. However, their primitive parameters for classifying race are no longer accurate today. Carolus Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, produced the first classification in 1735. He divided humans into four groups: Europaeus, Americanus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. Johann Blumenbach, a German professor of medicine, became the most influential scientist to classify human populations. He proposed the division of humans into 5 categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay. Blumenbach considered women of the Caucasus region in Russia to be the most beautiful of all Europeans, so he chose them to represent the European ideal type, and all other human groups were ranked as they related to his ideal. The racial classifications established by European men in the 18th century and adopted by the United States Founding Fathers continues to influence people's views and concepts of race in today's society, with those of European ancestry thought to possess superior traits and North American Indians and African slaves thought to possess inferior traits. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." However, in 1781 he wrote, "Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind." When the Founding Fathers drafted the U.S. Constitution, they decided that the number of seats each state was to have in the House of Representatives and the state's share of the cost of paying for the Revolutionary War would be based on population. Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, adopted in 1787, stated, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among several states which may be included within this Union. According to their respective numbers, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct." And thus the census was created. Dr. David Pemberton, the current U.S. Census historian, discusses the first racial classifications on the first U.S. Census.
There were 3 racial classifications in the first U.S. Census. It was essentially white, black, and red. We were going on colors in those days. Think of a palette. And as time went on, the color palette expanded a bit. But it was the first census had 6 questions on it. And it asked for the name of the head of the household, then how many free white males 16 years of age or older, how many free white males less than 16, how many free white females, how many other free persons in this household, and how many slaves.
The idea of distinct biological races has long been disproved by scientific study. Science has proven humans are one of the most genetically similar of all species. Anthropologists argue that physical variations have no meaning except the social ones that humans put upon them, and there is only one race, the human race. Dr. Yolanda Moses discusses the consequences of racial classifications.
So one of the things that racial classification did in the U.S., particularly through the census, is that it created a racially stratified society. That means that where there once was not very hard and fast rules about who was in what group and who was not, and why, with the racial classifications of the 1790 census, for example, it said that U.S. citizens were white, and that there were groups of people called slaves, and that people in the census were male and females, but primarily males were the ones who could vote. So it became a way to racially classify people in the United States, and that system, to a certain extent, still is in operation today in various ways.
The 1870 census introduced the category of mulatto, meaning all persons having any race of black heritage. Black and white race mixing was further categorized in the 1890 census, when quadroon, 1/4 black, octoroon, 1/8 black, and hexadecaroon, 1/16 black were added. How could the census marshal tell the percentage of black ancestry by looking at someone? This process of classification was most definitely one of the debatable issues in the early census, and it was deleted after the 1920 census. The increase in racial segregation during the Jim Crow era brought about the need to clearly distinguish between who was black and who was white. and so the hypodescent rule, or one-drop rule, was created, which stated that anyone with one drop of Negro blood was considered black in the eyes of the law and the U.S. Census. In 1964, the social unrest and protests of the Civil Rights Movement gave rise to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The U.S. government realized that the U.S. Census could be used as a tool to monitor and correct past racial injustices and inequality and collect accurate figures for civil rights enforcement. This was perhaps the biggest success to come from the census since its inception, and racial classification took on a new importance. Marriage between the races had long been against the law, but on June 12, 1967, the United States Supreme Court overturned the conviction of Richard and Mildred Loving, a white man and black woman who had married and as a result were banished from their state of Virginia for 25 years. The outcome of the case of Loving versus Virginia led to the end of the laws banning interracial marriage, and by the late 1960s the U.S. began to experience an increase in interracial marriages and the birth of many biracial children. In 1977, the Office of Management and Budget created OMB Directive 15, Standards for the Classification of Federal Data on Race and Ethnicity. It defined 5 main racial categories: American Indian, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, Hispanic, and White. How should mixed race or multiracial individuals be categorized? OMB Directive 15 did not allow for more than one race. You could be black or white but not both. Who could check the multiracial box? After all, the majority of Americans are actually products of mixed ancestry. Multiracial Americans who wanted to recognize all aspects of their heritage pressed for a multiracial category on the census forms. On the other side of the argument, the NAACP debated that the accounting of racial minorities would be affected if those who would previously have checked black now checked a separate multiracial box. Further complicating the debate is how the U.S. Census classifies people of Latina or Hispanic origin. People of Latino or Hispanic origin are considered an ethnic group, but can racially be black, brown, or white. In 1997, after much debate, a revision to Statistical Directive 15 was introduced, which appeared in the 2000 census. It stated that individuals could select more than one race, but it rejected the option of a new, single, multiracial category. It also allowed citizens to write in their race, which is proof that the parameters of racial classification are no longer accurate today.
If Americans are given the right to name themselves as from their own perspective, then those categories that were set up by the census from 1790 forward, even though they change a little bit each time, right, then those are not going to be as valid anymore, because they're not going to be based on what the federal government thinks the category should be, but they will be based on what U.S. citizens write in the blanks. And so if the Census Bureau has to use that, then that's really revolutionary in the sense that for the first time in American history, the people of the United States will be challenging those categories and will be challenging the racial hierarchy.
I'm the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. I was raised with the help of a white grandfather who survived a depression to serve in Patton's army during World War II, and a white grandmother who worked on a bomber assembly line at Fort Leavenworth while he was overseas. I've gone to some of the best schools in America, and I've lived in one of the world's poorest nations. I am married to a black American who carries within her the blood of slaves and slave owners, an inheritance we pass on to our 2 precious daughters. I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue scattered across 3 continents, and for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible.
The challenges faced by the census can be summed up by Representative Sawyer. The dilemma we faced is trying to assure the fundamental guarantees of equality of opportunity, while at the same time recognizing the populations themselves are changing as we seek to categorize them. To be effective, the concepts of individual and group identity need to reflect not only who we have been, but who we are becoming.